"Come into my parlour," said the spider to the fly. Yes, Operation Spiderweb appears on face value to have been a magnificent tactical success. The question remains, what were the strategic objectives and what will be the strategic consequences of such action? This is a quick Friday News Review special. I just wanted to update you on the latest information I had on this because, as always, there's a lot of data floating around in the media and we're getting a lot of reports. And the source for those reports, as always with our media, goes straight back to Ukrainian intelligence. We know Ukrainian intelligence has a history of lying blatantly about the facts of this conflict. Examples I can give you are, remember the two brave soldiers who held Shark Island against the hordes of the Russian Navy who were bombarding them. I don't know if you remember, they went down in history. They even made stamps on them. "Fuck you, Russian ships," or "Fuck you, Russian Navy," as they were pounded and killed on the island by the ruthless Russians. Only it appears to reappear alive, well, and unharmed in a prisoner exchange some months later. Then we had the Ghost of Kiev, which was a MiG-29 pilot scooting around the skies of Kiev like Batman, shooting down Russian planes left, right, and centre. Only we found he turned out to be footage from a video game. You can't get more blatant than that. Then, I don't know if you have forgotten, remember Ukraine form used to appear all over social media at the start of this conflict, telling us each day how many Russian tanks had been killed, destroyed, how many Russian soldiers had been killed. The only issue with that was that they very quickly came to a figure of 40,000 Russian dead, which straight away I disputed because Russia went into the initial stages of the conflict with 120,000 soldiers. That was pretty much accepted universally that that was the figure they started the conflict with. To have lost a third of your men within a few weeks of a conflict means you would be soundly defeated in that conflict. So it was quite clear to me that 40,000 Russians hadn't been killed, and as we now know, what the Ukrainians were doing was wiping out the name Ukraine in front of their casualty figures and inserting Russia because they were reporting their own figures but attributing it to the Russian military. Latest figures we have now are that Ukraine has in fact lost in excess of 1 million. The figures I have are 1.3 to 1.5 Ukrainian dead, as opposed to somewhere in the region of 90 to 130,000 Russian dead. Yes, it's pretty much a 10 to 1 ratio in terms of casualties in that conflict, which explains why Ukraine is continually losing and it has no hope of winning. So what about Operation Spiderweb? Well, Ukraine claims, and it's being reported once again largely as fact, that they have knocked out some, I believe they're saying the figure is 34% of the Russian strategic bomber fleet. The Russian strategic bomber fleet is roughly 120 aircraft. As always with Russia, yes, they do not publicize a lot of information. They're guilty of hiding their casualty figures and so forth. But the latest information I have is that they have roughly 120 strategic aircraft. By comparison, the US has 168, I believe it is, strategic bombers. So the Ukrainians are claiming they've knocked out 40 to 41 aircraft. The figures I have at the moment, the reliable figures I have, and these are subject to change, I'm just giving them to you as food for thought, but the figures I have are that the actual damaged aircraft, the actual written off aircraft, are in the region of 4 to 6 planes. That amounts to some 7% of the Russian strategic bomber fleet. So that's a massive difference, but given the history that the Ukrainian military has and the Ukrainian government has of lying about such events, I'll wait and see. I'm going to say that I put more store in the sources I have, which point to a much less successful operation. The Russians have become very adept at drone warfare, both at initiating it and defending from it. And they claim that their electronic warfare capabilities took down a lot of these drones that were launched. It was an amazing operation, some 18 months in the planning. It does have the hallmarks of foreign intelligence services all over it. Just like with the Kerch Bridge, when the Ukrainians claim to have blown up the Kerch Bridge in Crimea by themselves, which also, by the way, caused a 14-year-old girl to become an orphan because her parents, who were civilians driving over the bridge, were killed at the time. But Ukraine claimed that they'd done that. Of course, it later transpired that British intelligence were all over it. And I'll lay money on the fact that at some point it will come out that this Operation Spiderweb was heavily influenced, heavily involved by the British intelligence services. Britain is incredibly linked to the Ukraine intelligence services. They provide them with funding, they provide them with intelligence, with satellite data. Remember, Ukraine has no satellite network. Any long-range strikes that they conduct, and the longest range strike was Irkutsk base, which is right over. Remember, Russia is a Eurasian power. Irkutsk is 4,300 kilometers from the front lines in Ukraine. That kind of long-range striking indicates to me that Ukraine had help and didn't act alone. However, regardless, it was, to the extent of a military tactical planning perspective, a brilliant idea and very well executed by all accounts. They got these lorries covered with full of drones into Russia, smuggled them in, very successful. I'm not saying that they didn't plan a great operation. I'm just saying that, as always with Ukraine, their history of military operations has been one of vastly exaggerating and overestimating their successes. So I'm sticking with the fact that far less Russian bombers have been destroyed than we're being told at the moment. Regardless, tactically, we have to wonder, what is the issue at stake here? Why would you launch this operation on the very eve of the peace talks in Istanbul? Now, the Ukrainians will say, and there's a credible point to it, a credible logical argument, that it gives us a stronger negotiating position because we can show that we can hit Russia, we can force them to negotiate. I dispute that because I'll tell you why. This attack, whilst embarrassing and a massive political victory for Ukraine, no doubt about that. Well done to Zelensky, okay? Massive political victory in terms of public relations. But if you look at the history of Zelensky, that's what he's a master at. All his successes are, public relations successes. His actual work on the battlefield is a litany of failures, of tactical, strategic mistakes, of disasters. The only thing that man Zelensky is good at is PR. And this smacks of PR and not of being as successful as he would have you believe. The other issue is, it has not in any great way, in fact, it has barely dented Russia's ability to continue this war. It has barely affected their ability to strike at Ukraine. Even if they've knocked out 34% of the Russian strategic bombing fleet. Remember, many of the most effective missiles, such as the Kinzhal, are launched by F-31 Foxhound aircraft. These aren't strategic bombers. These weren't targeted. These weren't hit. So that force is still completely untouched. If you've knocked out 40 bombers, well, Russia still has approximately 80 that are still capable of attacking you, plus countless ground-launched missiles. So the actual balance of power has in no way changed. So you haven't weakened Russia to the point where you're forcing them to the negotiating table. In fact, all you're likely to have done is hardened their resolve to achieve a victory which is in their interests, which they're achieving anyway. Remember, Russia is unequivocally winning the ground battle. So what was the object of this? Given that I think Europe and the United Kingdom have their fingers all over it, and Europe and the United Kingdom are the ones who have been pushing to continue this war non-stop. Remember, Ursula von der Slaughter wants to raise 8 billion euros for a massive European defence union. The new head of the European Union, the Duchy, what's his name? Mark Dogrutter. He's an ardent, let's keep fighting, let's keep fighting. It's interesting that an attack would be made, which, if anything, was more than likely to incite Russia to keep fighting than incite them to look for a defence or a settlement. This has been made right on the eve of the Istanbul peace talks. I'm just an outside observer, but it smacks to me that this is an attempt to ensure that the peace talks are derailed, to goad the Russians into a large military response, where you can then turn around and go, look, Zelensky and his boys were ready to negotiate, but that evil bastard Putin walked away from the negotiations and continued the war. And it dumps the whole blame for the conflict back on Russia, which has been the objective of the Western world and the Western elite since this began. So 5 air bases were attacked. I can list them for you: Murmansk, Ryazan, Ivanovo, Irkutsk, Amur. 3 attacks were completely repelled, the Russians insist. So that's interesting. The Russians have come out and said the attacks on Ryazan, Ivanovo and Amur were repelled. So nothing got through there. So once again, that casts doubt on the number of planes damaged that the Ukrainians are claiming. I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong, but I'm suggesting it's less than 10 aircraft in total. And part of the reason for that, part of my skepticism, is that the Ukraine military initially posted on their Telegram channel that the cost to the Russian Air Force was $2 billion. Then they turned around and said, no, it's $7 billion. How can you be out by $5 billion? It smacks to me once again as Ukraine's habit of overinflating everything. Also not lost on this was there were 2 attacks on bridges, on infrastructure. Now, one at Bryansk brought down a bridge on a passenger train. There'd been a firefight there between the FSB, which is the Russian border security people, and a group of Ukrainians only 2 days before. And it's believed these were the people who were preparing this attack. The bridge came down on a passenger train, a civilian passenger train, killed 7 people that we know of so far, injured 71, including an 18-month-old baby who was found screaming in the wreckage, had to be cut out and was airlifted to hospital in a critical condition. That's terrorism, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I'm not saying or absolving the Russians of any Ukrainian casualties or saying that just one side is bad, one side is good. Both sides in a war commit heinous acts. However, what's interesting is we continually hear about Ukrainian civilian casualties, the vast majority of whom, by the way, are the result of Ukrainian anti-aircraft missiles falling down on Ukrainian civilian areas, because the Ukrainians have a history, a documented history, of placing their military infrastructure in civilian areas. And why do I say that's documented? Remember the initial report by Amnesty International, who came out and said Ukraine places its military facilities and hides them in schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks. That was in the Amnesty International report. Interestingly enough, the director of Amnesty Ukraine had to resign after releasing that report. Whoops. We didn't really want that information to get out, did we? That the Ukraine aren't always the nice shiny guys we think they are. However, what I find interesting is that where will be the international condemnation of making a bridge fall down deliberately on top of a passenger train? So waiting, not just blowing up the bridge and saying we're trying to get infrastructure and affect your logistical supply routes, waiting till a passenger train full of innocent civilians comes screaming along and dropping a bridge on it, killing some of them, wounding many of them, and causing what is, in anyone's terms, an act of terrorism. Will anyone condemn that? I mean, we had Anthony Albanese walk around, look at apartment blocks in Ukraine, which Amnesty now told us were actually military targets. Anthony Albanese at the time said it was a war crime. Well, will he mention that the bridge in Bryansk was a war crime, or will he conveniently ignore that? I suspect the latter. Anyway, we'll see what comes out of all of this in the coming days, and in months and perhaps years to come, we'll find out the real truth. But Ukraine, wonderful PR victory, and if the aim of the European Union and Ukraine and its backers, its 3 masters, as its ministers recently came out and said, if the aim is to keep the war going and admit to the fact that we are intending to try and find a strategic defeat of Russia, well then that truth will come to light. But so far, this has been no strategic defeat for Russia. It will have minimal, if any, influence on the frontline battlefield. And if the war drags on, which I suspect is the intent of this, Ukraine will continue to lose more territory and, sadly, more people.